So what happens to our most experienced employees when technological progress intersects with longevity? I think a lot of folks today are concerned that the aging workforce will lose out in that scenario, but is that necessarily the case? To discuss this question and to talk a bit more broadly about longevity and employment, we'd like to welcome you to Leadership Matters, a vlog where we delve into the big issues of today by interviewing leading thinkers. Now, I'm your host. My name is Michael Netzley, based here in Singapore and founder of the startup Extend My Runway, which is using neuroscience, commercializing neuroscience to support the aging workforce and longevity. And my co-host today is Tomasz Klevana. How are you, Tomasz?
I'm pretty good. Hello. I am a co-founder of Extend My Runway, and I'm coming to you today from Bratislava in Slovakia. So this is a truly global vlog.
Exactly. Precisely what I wanted to say. And I guess to make it even more global, our guest today is Professor Andrew Scott. And Professor Scott is a professor of economics at the London Business School. He is a top researcher on the longevity dividend, co-author of The 100-Year Life, which I'm sure many folks who are watching this vlog today have read the book, and co-author of today's topic and the new book, which actually we're on this side, The New Long Life. Professor Scott, Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Michael. It's a privilege.
And where are you from? Are you calling or dialing in from London today, or?
Yeah, no, I'm dialing in from central London. I work
London.
at London Business School. I was born in London. The world has become very, very global, but I've moved about 6 miles from where I was born. But there we go. True London.
There we go. There we go. Well, I've certainly enjoyed reading your book, and I have to admit it was kind of hard to find in Singapore because it is so fresh off the press. I had to go to Google Play just to find it.
We'll have to try and correct that. I think it's coming out of September, I think, in Singapore. I'm not quite sure why there's a delay, but yeah, so it'll be easier to get in September.
Well, it's great timing, though, because longevity has become such a big issue here, and I think globally with the COVID-19 crisis. And if we could, maybe the best way to begin, and since the book is so hot off the press, what really is your thesis around the new long life and this intersection of technology and longevity?
So I think it's sort of well, the idea is simple, that our life is being transformed and is set to be transformed. Just in a way that we adapted our lives and society with the Industrial Revolution, which created massive changes in what we do, how we work, separation of work and home, and in particular created a 3-stage life based around a 70-year life expectancy. We've got AI and robotics coming along, and we have what people refer to as an aging society, this increasing number of old people driven by fewer births and more people living for longer. And I think what is stunning about both of those forces is how negative people are about them. You know, AI, I mean, it varies from country to country. Singapore may be a little bit different, but in terms of AI and robotics, the concern is where everyone's going to lose their jobs. We're going to become enslaved by robots. This is an existential threat to humans. And then an aging society story is like, oh, those old people, this is, you know, what a problem. They can't work, they get ill. And that negativity seems extraordinary because what we've got is the prospect of healthier, longer lives and wonderful new technology. So the question is, we should be able to turn these to our advantage. I talk in the book about a Frankenstein syndrome where we worry our own achievements will rise up against us and enslave us. But we have to say, how do we individually prepare to seize the advantages? And what do we need from our governments, our corporations, and our education system to succeed? Because this is great. And my way of looking at it is if machines become more machine-like, we have a chance to become more human-like. And, you know, how do we seize the advantage of longer, healthier lives smart new technologies, but it does change things. And here we kind of build on the 100-year life, which said, well, we focus on an aging society, but how our aging is changing too. And what we should focus on is not the number of people aged over 65, but actually how long your life is going to last for, how much time you have ahead of you. Because everyone at every age, particularly in Singapore, has got more time ahead of them than past generations did at that age. And so, yeah.
I want to get into that. Now, before I do, how did you come to focus on the intersection of technology and aging? There's so many megatrends that could be shaping or informing this conversation. Why these two?
So, I mean, I would say there's sort of four big themes. There's technology, there's longevity, there's the environment and sustainability, and then sort of politics, which is both about redistribution within a country, but also just the rise of politics and the subsidence of markets and driving international relations. So there's lots to talk about. We think the technology and longevity ones come together very strongly in lots of different ways. Some of it is about AI coming up with longevity advancements. Some of it is about, using AI to support our aging better, preventative health. But the other thing is that in the 100-year life, we talked about your life's getting longer and you're going to have to work for longer. And one of the questions we always got was, but where are the jobs going to come from? We're going to see these jobs disappear. So we thought, all right, so how do we explain the link between what's happening in the job market through technology and longevity? And of course, what you get is this sort of very clear result, which is that we know technology is going to disrupt the labor market. And there's a big debate whether it will or won't create unemployment. What it will do is change the nature of your job, the skills you need, and create not just full-time jobs, but also gig economy contingent work. So you've got a longer life, the book of life's getting longer, but you're going to see more chapters and more transitions. And weave those two together and you get pretty big implications for careers, relationships, work, etc.
And it seems like one of the implications for you is that our concept of age becomes malleable. Is that a fair interpretation?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think to me, there's sort of, it's funny, I think there's sort of, the next book I want to write is, I think, on this theme, but you've got sort of two great books about age. You've got Cicero, who says, old age is a wonderful thing. People are wise and great and very human. And then you've got Simone de Beauvoir, who says, God, it's shit being old. Your body fails. No one listens to you. You're marginalized. And that's the debate that goes back and forth. But of course, I think what we've seen in the 20th century with this, particularly the second half of the 20th century, where we see these big improvements in life expectancy at 60, 70, and even 80, and we see improvements in average health at those ages, that we've improved how we age. This is where the aging society story of demographers misses, I think, a really big channel, which I'll call the longevity channel. Yeah, there's more old people, but how we're aging is changing. And that's about that malleability. And we know that to some degree, through our personal behavior, eating less, drinking less, smoking less, exercise, our environment, are we part of a community? Is the air clear, etc.? We have managed to improve how we live. And Singapore has been very much at the forefront of that with spectacular improvements. So that's proof positive that age is malleable. And then, of course, the scientists coming along looking at aging itself and saying, you've seen nothing yet. We're going to make it really malleable. So what does that malleability mean? I mean, we measure age chronologically, how many candles are on your birthday cake. But that's a pretty modern thing. That arose when governments in the 1800s started to keep birth certificates. And they started to become obsessed with your chronological age. Before that, most people didn't know when their birthday was. We didn't celebrate birthdays. We didn't sing happy birthday. We didn't have birthday cakes. But we fixed on chronological age. And the trouble with chronological age is it's not malleable. Every 12 months is 1 year. That's never going to change. But just think about, language in the UK. People say, you look good for your age, or you can't do that at your age.
Yes.
There's all sorts of other concepts of age, biological, psychological, sociological. And that's what's malleable. They're shifting in relationship to chronological age. But we measure everything with chronological age. Big problem.
Now, to that point, you made a very interesting statement that while the data you used was UK, the UK may be aging, but they're actually getting younger. How can we be aging and getting younger?
So this goes back to this issue about how you measure age, and it's easy to get grim about life expectancy because then you're talking about mortality rates. But one way of measuring age is how many candles on your birthday cake. But another way of measuring age is how many more birthday cakes you got to come. And if you look at the average Brit, certainly 2 years ago, and the numbers will be updated, the average Brit had never been older, but their mortality rate had never been lower. In other words, they never had so long left to live. And I think that's that really important concept here. Yes, there is an aging society. Yes, there are problems and challenges. But first of all, let's just celebrate. What a great achievement. We've got loads more people living beyond 65. Isn't that fantastic? Yeah. But we turn around and go, oh, goodness me, all these old people, which to me is to negate a great human achievement. And then to recognize actually how we're aging is actually changing. And I think putting that forward-looking perspective is important because I say those demographic pyramids, and you've seen them for Singapore and they're extraordinary. You draw a line at 65 and say, oh, look, there's all these old people. But if you flip it around and look up, what it means is a child born today will, almost guaranteed to live to their 70s, 80s, and probably 90s and even 100. And that means you've got more future, and then you have to prepare differently. You have to invest more in your future self because there is more future. And that, I think, is the really big change around aging. Rather than a backward-looking concept of age, we all need to be more forward-looking.
More forward-looking. And to this point, as we were preparing, Tomasz, you raised a great question about the book in terms of the barriers, ageism. Would you like to maybe, Tomasz, share a little bit about what you were thinking there?
Well, there certainly is a great deal of prejudice today against older people. And I would say that compared to other prejudices, this is one that is still very much tolerated by our societies. And we're talking about Singapore, we are talking about China, but also the West and Europe in general. Andrew, how do you see that issue? Do you encounter lots of ageism, and what would be possibly the most productive way to face that?
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly the evidence speaks very strongly around ageism, and this notion that chronological age pins down your behavior is a bad one. And there's another version of this, which is a sort of this generational labels we use of baby boomers and millennials, which falls into exactly the same trap. I give you, firms, for instance, I think by and large don't understand the over 65 market, and they call it an over 65 market. Can you imagine referring to an under 35 market? I mean, it would be a ludicrous thing to do. So there are stereotypes which probably have never been true, and they're out of date. And I think they're out of date for two important reasons. One, I'll call age inflation. Because, just as prices rise because of inflation, because we're aging better, 70 is the new 60. I don't particularly like that. I think 70 is the new 70. But, what we consider to be old is shifting. So there's that. And then secondly, the real secret of age, and it comes back to this malleability, is diversity. And that diversity in how we age means that the older you get, the bigger the spread in people's mental and physical health. And I think as we see more people over 65, we have to focus on people as individuals. But you're quite right, it's the most deep-seated ageism. Mark Zuckerberg has that quote, young people are just smarter. Can you imagine saying that about any other demographic group? That's extraordinary. So the question is, how do we overcome it? Now, I'm very concerned about ageism because it's clearly going to be a barrier. At its heart is this notion that chronological age tells you something significant, which it doesn't, or loosely does. I would say, though, that you don't change this overnight. It's very hard for society to rewire these things. But I think there are signs it's beginning to happen. And I think, for me, COVID is really interesting on two levels, as in terms of this debate. I mean, it's extraordinary in many other ways. The first is society around the world has said, we will crater the economy to keep old people safe. And actually, for all the sort of negativity we have about older people and the fear that they're sort of subject to prejudice, it's like, whoa, my country's got the worst recession for 307 years or something. And we know it's mainly to solve the lives of old people. So that's kind of reassuring.
It's amazing. We've seen the same thing in Singapore, where last week, 10 days ago, the Prime Minister stood up and spent 2.5 minutes of about a 22-minute speech talking about the aging workforce, the loss or the fear of retrenchment, and how committed they are to being able to not only raise the issue, but protect the employment prospects of this age group. And to even imagine hearing that 2 years ago, I never ever would have anticipated such
I
a
agree, and
response.
I think it clearly there's a lot of ageism. Going back to your question, Thomas, that needs to be tackled, and I'll perhaps give some ideas on how to do that. But Singapore, what is it? It's something like 43% of people aged 65 to 69 are still working.
It's
which
a huge,
is,
yes.
That's the OECD average is a quarter. So something's happening. I also worked out that over the last, between 2008 and 2018, 100% of the increase in G7 employment came from people aged over 55. So there's definitely ageism in the workplace, but actually something is sort of happening to change it. Now, how do we accelerate it? And I'm very worried about COVID because we're going to see high unemployment in a number of countries. A lot of people 50 plus will be made redundant because of ageism. They're expensive, they're seen as easy to lay off, and they're going to find it really hard to get new jobs because there's very big ageism in hiring. I think that's the biggest form of ageism. I think a lot of firms almost don't notice how old people are getting because people are aging better, but actually it's the hiring channel there's really profound ageism.
It's been,
so this is going to have to be a big debate. Sorry, yes, Michael.
Yeah. As I say, it's been fascinating. We've conducted over 180 hours of structured interviews over here, and people over the age of 50, and I think this is a global phenomenon as well, are deeply worried about losing employment. I think it was the ProPublica report about a year ago saying something like only 18% recover full employment.
Yeah.
But through these interviews, we also hear people in their 40s, talking about getting old and this fear of employment. So this really raises a question. What do we do when we see people simply accepting that narrative, when we see our own colleagues conducting research that's based on a three-stage model, even today? This point of view is just so deeply embedded into that master narrative. What can any institution or individual start to do?
Yeah, and you're right to look both at the individual and the institutions because we need bigger change. So some of this will be about including ageism along with other forms of discrimination and just being illegal. And you're seeing that happen more and more. I suspect that will also overlap with the sort of the disability legislation that firms have to support an environment for people with disabilities. That's not quite such a positive aging channel, and I think there's different sort of sides to that debate, but both of those two I think will be a role to play. The other thing, of course, is going to be groups such as yourself who are raising awareness of what you as an individual need to do, and to just make people aware that actually at 40 you're still pretty young.
Exactly.
And age, of course, isn't just about your chronological age. Doing things differently from your parents, which of course in Singapore is crucial given how rapidly life expectancy has increased. Looking around and seeing what other people your age are doing to overcome the constraints or to upgrade. But going back to the mid-40s, I mean, the stat that I always say when I'm sort of talking about this to people, which kind of you can hear the room go quiet. If you're in your mid-40s, you've probably got more work to go than you've done already.
Yeah.
And I think to me that's the sort of the real so that how do I prepare for that, and what do I want to do? Because I think that that mid-40s time is really interesting because you may be getting bored with what you're doing. And I think what's interesting for me for Singapore is that it's on many indicators doing a great job around an aging society. It's got focused on lifelong learning, it's focused on intergenerational measures, it's doing great in terms of getting older people in the workforce. It could do more, but it's doing really well internationally. It's at the frontier. I think the linear career path which comes with a three-stage life, that you get recruited in your early 20s. There's a career path that goes this way, and it might peak and you get stuck or you get kicked out, is something that really has to change. And I think that's going to be the big one for Singapore, where I think there's still a sense of the three-stage life is the right career structure with that linear career path. So what do firms need to do? They need to have multiple entry points. So you're not just recruiting at young, you're looking at all sorts of different ages. You need to have the option for people to ramp up and ramp down their commitments so they can do caring as well as having a career, and refashion retirement and a focus on reinvention and lifelong learning. That's a big ask. Some firms would do it because they would do the right thing. Some firms would do it because they know that actually it's going to bring about a smart workforce, and that's good for them, and they will recognize diversity is good and age is part of that. Some firms also do it because they realize there's just not many young people and I've got to adapt to this. So I've got to make my work more attractive. And some will do it too because they're going to recognize that the consumer's getting older, so I need my workforce to match. But there's something else which I think is interesting here, and I try not to do age stereotypes, whether they're good or bad. But you said at the beginning, technology and old people, what's it going to mean for the labor market? Well, as machines get smarter at being machines, the jobs that will be more available will be those that require human skills. And I don't know what your evidence and research suggests, but in general, what you see is that older people are good at empathy, they're more about teams, they have greater human understanding, caring possibly might be a strong point. Those are skills that are actually going to be quite in demand. And what's interesting about those skills is they don't necessarily require a PhD in sort of neurophysics, neurobiology. They're quite core human skills. So I think the labor market could actually be boosted. And then of course, robotics, as we're seeing in Japan and Korea, also help maintain productivity in manufacturing for older workforce.
And as I think about this, everything we're doing absolutely agrees with you. I would call our agenda over here age positive, that there are actually things we get better at with age.
Yeah.
And these are not insignificant. In fact, I would say they are critical to business success, organizational success. We get better at managing complexity. We get better at innovative cognition. There's a whole list coming out of the neuroscience of things that we actually improve at. But that's where, I guess, maybe one more question before we move to our final one. Is reskilling enough? Because if we think about what aging is and that decline at a molecular level, that decline at a physical, operational level, and eventually that decline at the cognitive level, somehow it seems like an aging agenda that focuses only on reskilling is inherently biased to that 18 to 32 group, because that's when you're best at putting a lot in your head and figuring out, what am I going to go do with this? Do we need to think beyond reskilling?
So 100%. I mean, what we know about a good long life is it becomes a good long life because you have a sense of purpose and a sense of engagement. And that isn't the same thing as reskilling. It might involve transition and change and a sense of flexibility and putting yourself in different situations, but it's a much, much broader concept of reskilling. And of course, I think what's interesting about these longer lives is that it gets a little bit almost sort of Buddhist-like, I think, for me, but if we're going to go through these multiple stages with these transitions, what is the real human outcome, which is to know yourself? Which is different from reskilling. It can be, if I reskill, I actually realize this is what I'm good at. I'm not actually a mathematical economist. I'm actually someone who goes this rather than that. But I agree. And I think, in terms of technology, there's a bunch of issues here. First of all, I don't think you can expect everyone to reskill, whether they're old or young, to get the jobs to become full stack developers or whatever. So we've also got to focus on creating jobs for the skills that people have got. And I think that's really, really important. I think the reskilling thing, though, is more about how you see yourself going forward and accepting change And sometimes that change will be imposed upon you, and sometimes it will be you driving it. And so it's about repurposing, repositioning, of which reskilling may be a component. But yeah, I think it's about that malleability and thinking, actually, you know, I'm 55, and I probably need to spend time with different people of different ages with different values to update my own perspectives. And I think that's the important thing about this longer life.
Great. Tomasz, I apologize. I have so many questions today. Why don't I hand the final question over to you?
That's perfectly fine, Michael. I was actually thinking about my daughter, who is in her early 20s. And when I compare myself to her, when I was in my early 20s, she clearly has a longer time for professional development ahead of herself than I had. And we all had, right? We are all in our 50s. So how is this going to change the workforce, the intergenerational dynamic in a company? What is going to be required of these employers who will be actually facing this issue, which is quite new?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the lens they have of looking at it is this sort of Gen X, millennial, baby boom, which I think is so misleading. I call it demographic astrology. You know, the idea that your character is formed by the dates in which the months in which you're born is just crazy. And there's some truth in it, but it's much, much misleading. Everyone is adapting to a new way of life and having more time ahead of them. And the current career map doesn't cope with that. And the younger you are, the more dramatic it is. And, you know, I'm an economist. I always like to translate things into economic terms. But your daughter has a lot of value of options. You know, my father at 14 has got a job. He's paying rent. He's married at 17. He's got a house at 18 and kids at 19. Wow, that's commitment. But as life extends and your daughter has a very plausible chance of living to 100, why would you commit so early? And so you have to have your options open. You have to learn who you are and what you value rather than just commit to something. And you have to recognize that your life will be about discovering who you are and basing around that. And that's why people are getting married later, having children later, and committing to careers later. But of course, it has huge implications for firms, because if you're trying to recruit someone at 21 and you think they're going to stay with you for the rest of their career, it ain't going to happen. First of all, you may not get them at 21, you might have to get them at 31. And you're going to have to just become a whole lot more flexible. And I think that's the key, because actually what we see is that everyone of every age wants to have purposeful, flexible employment. And it's coming in different voices at different stages, but actually it's all one and the same. And, you know, for me, I think what firms have to do is to reinvent the concept of a pension. In the 20th century, firms invented a pension as a recruitment and retention tool. Let me offer you a lower salary today for money in the future, and the longer you stay, the more money I'll get later. Then companies said, we can't afford this. This is crazy. You know, people are living so long. Let's stop it. But I think, you know, one of the consequences of longer life is you've got time, and we have to rearrange time differently. And money is just a way of shuffling time in a way. You know, I give my time today for money so I can have some leisure later. There's lots of different ways you can do that trade-off. So what firms need to do is say, okay, this person who I got at 21, they've been here 7 years, they want to go away for a year. They want to travel, or they want to study. Or, you know, they're in their 50s, they can look after elderly parents. They need to drop down and have a less intensive way of working. And that ability to offer a more flexible career path where you can ramp up and down, take sideways moves, take time out and come back is, I think, the real sort of modern corporate pension. I'm not just thinking about my future financial assets, but my health, my relationships, and my skills. And to me, I think that's the key thing. And if you think of it at that point of view, you can start to see actually how useful that's to be. Because going back to your point about ageism, Thomas, it's the weirdest ism, because the thing about this longevity is that a 20-year-old today is almost guaranteed to be 80 in 60 years' time. 100 years ago, that wasn't the case. So you really could talk about a battle between the young and the old, because most of the young never became old. In a world where all the young will become old, actually it's about the map of life and thinking of it in this consistent way. But we think of it in terms of this battle between the generations. But there's a core need that I think it holds it together. And that's what I hope firms will start to understand, actually. It's not about looking after the 50-year-olds, it's also thinking, well, the 20-year-old will become 50 and starting to think in that perspective. But we think of an aging society. There's these people and there's those people. Instead, we need to look at the life path much more, because that's the great invention.
The New Long Life, co-authored by Professor Andrew Scott and Professor Lynda Gratton. Andrew, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to hear from you and to introduce the book. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Michael and Tom. I really enjoyed it. It was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.